Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 8, Jacques, Rousseau, and we are starting critical appreciation. There seems to be an obvious divide and fundamental logical discrepancy between his earlier writings in Discourse on Inequality and the later work Social Contract. As Guan says, the first phase of his work is marked with defiant individualism, while in the later there is an equally defiant collectivism. Rousseau himself, however, never felt such an opposition. In the Confessions, he says that every strong idea in the social contract had been, before published in the Discourse on Equality, Sabine opines that Rousseau is correct in his opinion, though it is also true that incompatible ideas abound in his writings. Much that seems defiant individualism persists in social contract, as for instance the use of the concept of social contract for generation of general will. The difference between the earlier works and the social contract is merely that in the former he is writing himself free from the uncongenial social philosophy, and in the later he was expressing a counter philosophy of his own. The social philosophy from which he disengaged himself was that of systematic individualism, which believed that man was moral and rational, had sense of ownership and inherent rights, that man cooperated out of enlightened self-interest, that community or social group was created out of universal selfishness and was utilitarian in nature, meant for the protection of rights and promotion of happiness or self-satisfaction, and that in itself it had no value, though it protects values. Rousseau was critical of this systematic individualism in Locke because it did not concur with human nature the way he understood it. For Rousseau, the attributes of rationality, the power to calculate, the desire for happiness, the idea of ownership, the power to communicate with others and enter into agreement for creating a government are all attributes acquired by men through living in society and not attributes of a natural man. Besides, Rousseau thought that it was absolutely false to think that reason by itself would ever bring men together if they were concerned only with their individual happiness, because even the idea of self-interest arises from the communities in which men live. Secondly, self-interest is not more natural or innate than the social needs that draw men together in communities. Rousseau considered that over and above self-interest, men have an innate revulsion against sufferings in others. The common basis of sociability is not reason but feeling. The calculating egoist of the theories exists not in nature but only in perverted society. Consequently, their theories were wrong and had shades of the evil contract in the discourses on inequality. Human nature could best be understood by going beyond the stage of socialization. This neither Hobbes nor Locke do. For them, the state of nature is a stage prior to political order. Though Hobbes says state of nature is pre-social, it is an in fact not, because the attributes of the Hobbesian men are those of the public person. Natural egoist is a fiction for Rousseau. In developing his counter philosophy, Rousseau got immense help from the classical Greek thought that it is in the nature of man to associate with others in organic ways, which means that the development of each is dependent upon the development of all. Without such organic relations, man cannot realize his true nature or attain his full stature as a man. Solitude and separatism is contrary to his nature. Robinson Crusoe is thus a false model, that it is only in society that man acquires right, freedom, and morality. Outside the society, there might be independence and right as mere force only, but no morality. That man is what the community makes him. If the socialization is bad, his nature will be twisted and wrapped. That community is the chief moralizing agent and therefore represents the highest moral value, and that political subjection is essentially ethical and only secondarily a matter of law and power. With insights gleaned from classical Greek philosophy, Rousseau worked out his own political theory. It rejected systematic individualism, compelling one to think that society was more than a heap of individual atoms, that good for all, the public good, cannot be produced through each individual's pursuit of private interest or universal selfishness. Unless men thought beyond their private interest in terms of public interest or the good of the whole of which they are integral part, they could not attain their own good. Moreover, only when individuals are disposed towards thinking in terms of public good, that authority which is required for order and freedom, which is needed for felicity or self development, can be reconciled. Locke and Hobbes both failed in this reconciliation because they had a false theory of men. Locke becomes fearful of authority while securing liberty, hopes for the sake of order and tranquility, sacrifices individual at the altar of the sovereign. There is much value in the philosophical insight of theory of general will, and it led to an alternative conceptualization of state, not as a machine, but as an organism. But Rousseau did not care to work out the practical implications of his theory. One consequence of this has been that whereas Rousseau had set out to provide a philosophical justification for democratic governance and resolve the tension between the authority and freedom found in the mechanistic theory of state, quite contrary to his intentions, Rousseau becomes for many an apotheosis of modern totalitarianism. His theory of general will unfortunately provided a pretext for any arbitrary ruler to coerce recalcitrant subjects, pleading that they, much as they are enslaved to their particular wills, do not know what the general will is. In this context, the paradox of freedom in Rousseau's acquired dangerous propensities. Liberty became the honorific word, the name for a sentiment with which even attacks on liberty could be baptized. But even more dangerous was the implied view that a man whose moral convictions are against those commonly held in his community is merely capricious and ought to be suppressed. As Sabine comments, this was perhaps not a legitimate inference from the abstract theory of general will, because freedom of conscience reality is a social and not merely an individual good. But in every concrete situation, the general will has to be identified with somebody of the actual opinion, and moral institutionalism usually means that morality is identified with standards which are generally accepted. Forcing a man to be free thus becomes a euphemism for making him blindly obedient to the mass or the strongest party. In a way, such abuse happened because the theory of general will was too abstract, and there was difficulty with regard to its location or identification. That general will is always right is merely a truism because it stands for social good, which is itself the standard of right. But how does this absolute right stand in relation to many possibly conflicting judgments about it? Who is entitled to decide what is right? Sabine writes that Rousseau's attempt to answer these questions produced a variety of contradictions and evasions. Similarly, Wiper comments that unfortunately Rousseau cannot help us here. He can never tell how we can be sure of finding the general will. So much vagueness about something as important as the findings of the general will is to be regretted. Notwithstanding such criticism, the significance of Rousseau cannot be ever diminished. In defense of Rousseau, it may be said, and Ebenstein has observed, that he was the first modern writer to have attempted, though not always successfully, to synthesize good government, what self-government in the key concept of the general will. The classical doctrine of Plato and Aristotle had emphasized good government at the expense of self-government, and the more modern ideas of Locke and the liberal school were concerned principally with self-government. It relegated the problem of good government into background. Secondly, Rousseau also was clearer than the conventional liberal doctrines that the end of the government is not confined to the protection of individual liberty, but also includes equality, because liberty cannot exist without it. In the social contract, one may not notice the hostility that he showed to the institution of private property in the discourse on inequality, but he does not abandon the ideal of economic equality. No citizen shall be ever wealthy enough to buy another, and none poor enough to be forced to sell himself. Rousseau realizes that in practice it is very difficult to maintain the ideal of equitable distribution of property, but it is precisely because the force of circumstances tends continually to destroy equality that the force of legislation should always tend to its maintenance. Whereas Locke failed to see property as a relation to domination of men over men, Rousseau clearly recognizes property as a form of private domination that had to be kept under control by the general will. Third, Rousseau was not socialist in the modern sense of term, yet indirectly this part of Rousseau, the stress on equality, has aided the development of socialist sentiment by sharpening the awareness that political liberty and crass economic inequality are ultimately incompatible if democracy is to survive and expand. And secondly, that all rights, including those of property, are rights within the community and not against it. Fourth, Rousseau himself was in no sense a nationalist, though his philosophy contributed to the nationalism by reviving the intimacy of feeling and the reversions connotated by citizenship in the city state. He made it available, at least as an emotional coloring, to citizenship in the national state. The cosmopolitanism implied by natural law he chose to regard as merely a pretext for evading the duties of a citizen. To our present times, Rousseau's ideas are still very relevant, for how often we have laminated the unrepresentative character of the representative party democracy and feared the state turning against the people, and as bulwark against such depredation, have wished to strengthen the civil society for the sake of protecting and retrieving our freedom. No less frequent has been the lament that the problems of our society caused by the spoiling of several primordial ties have arisen because of the failure to take the value of citizenship seriously. His theory of popular sovereignty is a constant reminder to citizens to guard against the usurpation of power by the executive. The record of free government everywhere has proved that there can be no reliance on contrivances and institutions alone in the eternal struggle for liberty, and that its survival depends in the last analysis on those moral qualities that Rousseau calls general will, justice, virtue. In addition, we and also find presence of Rousseau in Rawlsian theory of distributive justice, in the conception of development and expansion of human capabilities. And perhaps it would not be wrong to suggest that Rousseau, as critic of civil society, is a precursor of Marx and much of the radical thought ever since. Now let us have look at the summary of the unit. Although many classifying him as an Enlightenment thinker because in many ways he did advocate Enlightenment ideas, Rousseau is also highly critical of the Enlightenment and modernity in general. Rousseau thinks that the civilization corrupts human beings. He equates civilization with vanity and arrogance. Rousseau believed that what was wrong with the modern man was that he had lost touch with his feelings. Rousseau's regard for rationality is mixed with an equal or greater regard for feeling. Critiquing the civil society of his contemporary time, he pointed out that the social order was founded for the protection of private interest and property, that private property was at the root of the social inequality, injustices, and exploitation, and that such a civil order was contrary to man's nature. Since society was inevitable, man cannot unlearn himself to return to the woods, and the realization of man's nature depended on the nature of socialization. The task for him was to suggest the just principles upon which to found a socio political order that would be conducive to the realization of human freedom. Rousseau accomplishes this task of his social contract, whereas Rousseau lays stress the blueprint of the required political society. This ideal political society is set up through a social contract in the imaging of a community possessing a general will. which is sovereign and which, while always aiming at the general good, comes from all and applies to all equally. In Rousseau's theory of general will, freedom and authority automatically gets reconciled, as there is no tension between the two. The earlier theories, which were premised on individual separatism and the need to preserve and protect private interest through setting up an authority, failed to properly reconcile authority with freedom because it had a faulty theory of men and society. Now we want to wind up this lecture and we have come to the end of the unit. Thank you so much for your attention.